For part 5, we're going to put together what we learned about demand with what we learned about supply and study the idea of equilibrium in a market. So, when we talk about equilibrium, what are we talking about? There's two things. The equilibrium price is the price that causes the quantity supplied to equal the quantity demanded. The equilibrium quantity is the amount that is supplied and demanded at the equilibrium price. So, when we're talking about equilibrium and supply and demand, what we're going to look for is the intersection of the demand curve and the supply curve. Why are we looking at the intersection of these two things? Well, the intersection is where the amount that's supplied and the amount that is demanded are equal to each other at the same price. At a higher price, we're going to have a different level of demand than supply. At a lower price, we're also going to have a different level of supply than demand. So the question we might ask is, what makes this an equilibrium? An equilibrium is a situation where things are relatively unchanging, where they have their balance, where they're not likely to tip over to one side or another. And the basic idea is that if the price is higher than the equilibrium price, we're going to have quantity supplied greater than quantity demanded. So this leads to a situation that is sometimes called excess supply or a surplus of unsold goods. That situation of a surplus of unsold goods puts downward pressure on the prices, as there are lots of willing sellers for every willing buyer. If the price is lower than the equilibrium price, then we're going to have quantity demanded greater than quantity supplied. So there are more willing buyers than there are willing sellers. This is sometimes called a situation of excess demand, or a shortage. This shortage, or competition between buyers for the scarce goods, is going to tend to put upward pressure on price. Sometimes people talk about the law of supply and demand, and we already saw the law of demand, the idea that when we cut prices, people will buy more, and when we increase prices, people will buy less. And we already saw the law of the law of supply, which is the idea that if we raise prices, people will be willing to sell us more, and if we cut prices, people will be willing to sell us less. The law of supply and demand is the idea that prices adjust, bringing the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded into balance. And this generally seems to hold true. In most markets, surpluses and shortages are temporary. And notice that when an economist says there's a shortage, they mean something in particular. They mean that at the going market price right now, there are more willing buyers who are actually willing to pay that amount of money than there are willing sellers. Likewise, if economists talk about surpluses, they mean at the current going market price, there are more people willing and able to sell than people willing and able to buy. So in most markets, we tend to see that surpluses and shortages are temporary. There are some exceptions to this, though. One way to characterize unemployment is that it's a situation where we have a surplus in the labor market. There are people who are willing and able to work for the current wage, the going market wage, but they can't find anyone to hire them. So, why do we tend to see exceptions to this idea that market prices adjust to bring supply and demand into balance? We'll go ahead and study those later in the semester, but essentially a lot of them come down to violations of this idea of a market where there's minimal product differentiation or violation of the many buyers and many sellers idea.